Today we're going to talk about the basics of Adobe After Effects and video editing paradigms in general. First, a little brief on what After Effects is. After Effects is a video editing tool used to create cinematic movie titles, transitions, credits, animations, motion graphics, and a lot more. I personally use After Effects to edit a lot of the video. A lot of people use Premiere Pro to edit footage, but I don't often work with a lot of footage, so I use After Effects for most anything video related I'm working on. If you're looking for After Effects to work with, a lot of computers on campus have Adobe programs, and you can also use their software for $20 a month if you're a student. Okay, so if we're getting started from the very beginning, I want to show you what it looks like when you open up After Effects for the first time. You'll get this splash screen where you can create a new project, open a project, and see other projects you've been working on. I'm going to create a new project for now. Okay, so what we see here is the main interface of After Effects. You have a project panel, you have a composition panel, and you have a timeline, and you have your tools up here. So when you click on each one of these, you'll get this blue highlight to show which you're working in. And that's important because if you're using keyboard shortcuts, it's context sensitive depending on what you are clicked on. But these are your main three panels that you'll work with. And the menu bar up here is important too, has your typical menu functions like opening projects, editing, compositions, layers, and effects that we'll get into a bit later. Cool, yeah, so I'll get into each one of these. So the project panel right here is a layout of all the files that you have. Ours is currently empty, so I'm going to import something from the file explorer. Easiest way to do this, in my opinion, is just to drag and drop your video content into this project folder, and it'll pop up right here. It'll show you if it has audio. It'll show you details about it. You can also double click here to import files. Many ways to do this. I don't use a lot of these features often, but you can also drag over here to create a new folder with your content in it. You can just click it to create new folders, keep everything organized. Right here, you can sort your content. I'll add some more so that we can see what that looks like. So moving on from the project panel. Before we move on, you can also create labels here if you're working with a lot of different footage. You can also set these colors. And there's also this search bar that's helpful if you're looking for specific media. Sometimes I'll drop in a lot of pre-made transitions and stuff, and I can just look for what I need and it'll pop up. Another useful thing you'll find is if you have content loaded in, I'll just load this to show you. It'll show you how many times the media is used in the project, although I don't see it popping up. I'm probably not doing it correctly. You can also sort by used and unused, which is really useful if you're dropping in a lot of pre-made clips. So the main thing you have to understand about After Effects is we work in compositions. A composition is essentially like a video layer. You can think of it like that. So here, when I drag and dropped this into here, it automatically created a new composition. And what I just did was I closed this. So here in the Windows panel is where you can open and close your different panels. So I closed the composition panel, and I can just open it back up here. So if you close anything on accident, like I did earlier, you can find most things in this window, and the most important stuff down here. So compositions you can think of as video layers. And within a video layer, you have actual layers. You can also create a new composition here. Composition, new composition. I usually can use Control N. And here you get a list of settings of what you want this composition to be. So you can rename it. And then the most important stuff here is there's presets. If you don't want to mess with things, and you can create new presets. If I set this to HD TV 1080p 24 frames per second, it automatically sets the width 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second. Pixel aspect ratio. And another important thing is this duration right here. When you're creating compositions, and if you want to think of them as building blocks for your final piece, you'll want to change this a lot, because there isn't a good way that I've found to change how long a composition is besides in these settings. So if I want to make this 30 seconds, we have a new empty composition, and you can get to the composition settings anytime with Control K, or going up here and hitting composition settings. So we created a new composition, and if you want to add media, you can drag and drop into the timeline, and it'll drop on the timeline wherever you dropped it. If you're moving clips around the timeline, useful tool is holding Shift, and it'll snap to the beginning or end. This right here is your timeline marker. It shows you where you are in the timeline clip. So compositions can contain videos, layers. It can also contain things generated in After Effects, like shapes. It can contain effects. And if we want to import more video to work with, or even an image, you can see them here. This will show above this because this is above it in the timeline right here. So first basic things is, if we want to move stuff around in the composition, if you have your layer selected, you'll see these little squares. If you click inside of the square anywhere on the layer, you can move it around. If you click the squares, you can resize. It won't maintain aspect ratio unless you hold Shift. So if we want to start getting into the tools up here, we have the selection tool selected, which is why we can move things around. There's other tools like the shape tool, pen tool, type tool. And one thing that I like to use when I'm working with moving layers around is there's a few shortcuts that I think are really helpful. For example, W is the rotation tool. V is the selection tool. P pops up this position right here when we'll get into keyframes in a bit. S will pop up scale. R will pop up rotation. And you might be wondering, why is there two tools for rotation versus the rotate tool. Well, this is if you want to physically move around your layer. And this is if you want to set keyframes and animate things. We'll get those in a bit. So when we're working with compositions, we can also, there's also a tool that we use called pre-compositions. So we have our new comp one, and if we decide that we want to group these two layers so that they are in you can think of it as a nested composition, we can put them into a pre-comp or a pre-composition. And you can do that by doing composition. Oh, actually, the way that I do it is I go here, right click, and do pre-compose. There's probably more ways to do it. And in a pre-composition, it'll send that into what looks like one collapsed layer here. Double click this, and this will take us into where we just were. You can switch back between those fast right here. You can see we have new comp one and then pre-comp one. And I'll demo out how that can be useful in a bit. Okay, so why would we want to do this? There's a lot of, After Effects is really good for animating things. That's probably its main use. So if you want, for example, a lower third over here that has information that pops out, I think that probably one of the best ways to do this is pre-comps. So if we want to create a rectangle, I'll right click here, do a new shape layer. You'll see it right there. And I'll draw a quick little rectangle. You can see all the handles that we can use the selection tool to resize. This centerpiece shows where the center of the rectangle is, so you can actually change that. So if you wanted it to resize from one side, you can move it. But if I wanted to create some info right here, position this how I want, I just selected the type tool right here, place it where I wanted it. The type tool has some options on the top right. You can change how big things are. So if I wanted to create an animation where this pops out from the side and maybe pops back, I don't want to have to animate that all separately. So what I would do is I would pre-comp these two layers, right click, pre-compose. And press OK. And then in here, I can adjust these later as needed, but I want to go back to here and animate this lower third. So if we want to get into animations, how do we do that? So if you click this little arrow here, you see a list of things that you can change over time, essentially. You have transform, you have position, scale, rotation, opacity, and most of these are going to be pretty basic because some of the other things you can change are going to be within the composition. Like, for example, if you wanted to change how big the rectangle was, you would have to go in here. So if I want to animate this all together, that's a transformation and that's a position. So I think the easiest way to do this is just to move it where I want it to start. Well, first, actually, we want to move the player head indicator. It's Adobe calls it the current time indicator, the CTI. We want to move this where we want the beginning of the animation to be. So if we put this at 0 seconds, let's say we want it to start out here. And the easiest thing to do here is just to click this little stopwatch, and this will toggle an animation. So we clicked it, it turns blue, and it shows this little blue diamond, and that's the indicator for a keyframe. And essentially a keyframe is a method of recording the value of a parameter at a specific point in time on the timeline. Sounds abstract, but basically I set a keyframe here that says at 0 seconds, the lower third pre-comp that I just made should be at position 168, 554. So if I want it to pop in over 2 seconds, I'll skip the player head to 2 seconds, and then I'll move this lower third back right here. You get this little visual indicator of how far it moves. And when you move it, it automatically will create a new keyframe to where you move it. So already I clicked about 3 times and there's already an animation here. But oftentimes it's not enough to just have things move back and forth. Looks a little stiff. Also, I hit spacebar there to play back the video. So if we want to affect actually where it is in between these 2 keyframes, there is a button right here called the graph editor. Again, it's context sensitive, so you want to have this selected before you click the graph editor. And you will see the graph of the position. And this is really good for me because I'm a visual person and I like to see exactly what it's going to look like. So oftentimes when I'm working with animations, we want to do not something that's linear, we want to do a Bezier curve. So to change it so that it's more of a curve automatically, you can click the keyframes here. And there's a bunch of options right here, but the one I want to focus on are these options right here: easy ease, auto Bezier, ease out, ease in. I'll just click audio Bezier. Nothing happens. So this is part of my exploration on what these do. I'll click this keyframe again and try the ease function. And you can see it just popped up a bit of a curve right there. And if I want to take a closer look at this, there is a zoom in interface right here. That's pretty straightforward. You can zoom in or out. So I want to zoom in, and now I can see that the easy ease button automatically made this to be more of a curve. So it slows down before it gets to the end right here. Want to make sure this one has the same setting. But even if it's not enough, what would I do here? Well, if I want it to really slow down, I could even set another keyframe. So I would do that by setting the playhead right here, hitting the keyframe button, and I can actually drag this exactly where I want it. So if I want this to really slow down, it can look like that, or even more extreme. All right, looks good for now. So that's the basics of animating something. You can also animate things like scale, rotation, opacity. Maybe I want it to start out opaque, completely transparent. So I'll set some keyframes. I'll move this to 0. And at 2 seconds, let's make this 100. And if you noticed, just dragging and changing this value automatically made a keyframe. So now it fades in. And you'll notice at the beginning, I hadn't mentioned this, but this tile pattern is what is the transparent part of the video. So that's just alpha layer. So like I said, you can preview things by hitting spacebar. And you'll notice this green right here will go away if I move anything. And essentially what that is that is the render engine of After Effects. And if it's green, it means this part of the layer has been rendered. So this gets in a bit of how After Effects works. But essentially, if you don't change anything, it will keep it in a memory of what the render is. But if you change things, it will have to re-render. And it doesn't want to re-render things all the time because that's very taxing on your computer. So it'll only render things when you need it. So if I play here, you see it filled in really fast. And I'll get into a bit more about managing that in a second. First, I want to talk about effects really fast. So right now, transform is like the most basic effect you can have. But if I wanted to add more, you can apply effects by selecting a layer and choosing an effect in the effect menu, which we can see right here. And there are tons of effects to play with. They're all very fun and interesting. I just downloaded some Cinema 4D effects that I'm tempted to look at, but I'll go with something I know, like the distort. So distortion is self-explanatory. There's a bunch here. Let's go with bulge. And what bulge does is it'll give you some controls. There we go. So it looks like what bulge does is it'll do this fisheye lens where you put this ellipse, this circle right here. So maybe I wouldn't probably want to do this, but maybe I want this to move from right to left as the lower third comes in. So again, I'm going to put my timeline at 0. Oh, okay, so this is important. It looks like this bulge effect is actually tied to the transformation. So if I want the bulge effect to move, I can go to 0, set it right here, set a keyframe on the bulge center. And then at 2 seconds, let's move it to right there. And it automatically makes all this. I don't have to think about it too hard. Of course, I can set this ease function and it'll look like that. Very fun. Effects are very fun. That's the whole point of After Effects, I would think. And if you decide you don't like it, it's easy enough to delete. You can also toggle it on and off with this button right here. So if we watch it back, it's essentially muted. And then if we wanted to delete it, we can either delete it here out of the effects folder, or just delete the whole effects tab itself. I guess I didn't mention this, but this is how you show and hide layers. The little eye indicator. You can mute layers as well. So I wanted to mention how you can manage your storage, because this is kind of a tricky thing that I had to learn, especially when you start working with larger projects, and you have to worry about all this rendering that goes on. You can see here, I filled it in, but if I change any of this, I have to re-render it all. So the way that After Effects works is that it will render this all to memory on your disk. And that memory can fill up and it will affect your performance. So this is a helpful tip. If you ever are running low on memory, and it'll sometimes give you a notification, you can go to Edit, Purge, All Memory and Disk Cache. And it'll give you a pop-up. Do you want to delete all files 2.8 gigabytes from your disk cache? Yes. And now you'll notice it has to re-render this because that's where that was being stored. But if you have changed a bunch of your actions, changed a bunch of your layers, you have a bunch of memory that you don't need anymore. So if you're working with a computer that is struggling, it's very useful sometimes to purge this. Another useful tip when it comes to this is I have a computer with a multiple drives on it. And so I want to set my cache disk or my disk cache on a different drive because I don't want it on where my operating system is located. So you'll go here, you'll go to media and disk cache in the preferences. And you'll get a lot of settings in these preferences. Here's a button to enable the disk cache. And what's important here is you can choose the folder where all that memory is stored. So I have a dedicated drive for caching that I want to change, and it's as easy as choosing a folder. So if you have a computer with multiple drives, I would recommend trying this. And you can also set how big you want the disk cache size to be, so you can worry about it less, worry about it more. Either way, that's the main thing. So if I want to get back to the new composition, oh, I'm already there actually. But I actually want this video to start earlier. You notice it pops in. And I remember I put it in this pre-comp, so I'll double click that. And you can see how long it is. So I want it to start at the beginning. And you can also edit how soon it stops by these little arrows right here. And another trick that I found out is oftentimes I will want video to loop. I work with a lot of looping video, especially if you have like background content or something. And it doesn't seem like there's any easy way to do this. So what I found is that you have to go to where the footage is stored. This is line swirl 2, here it is. Right click, and there's an option to interpret footage. I end up working with this a lot, especially if you want to change frame rate. You can force it to use a frame rate. You can set a time code. But what I'm interested here is this other options, loop 1 time. I'm going to set this to loop 3 times. And we see it has created the option for it to loop 3 times, but it hasn't done it yet. So I'm just going to drag this out to the end. And now if I hit play, I'll see that it keeps looping. And this video is a perfect loop, so you won't notice it looping. But I use that option a lot because I work with a lot of looping video. So I go back to my composition and I'm satisfied with my really cool video. And I want to render it. I want to use this video. It's 30 seconds long. You can see this other video cuts out right before the end. I want to keep that just to see what it looks like. So now we want to talk about rendering. So there are a few different ways to render in After Effects. The first way is to use the built-in After Effects rendering. And you can do that by clicking the layer that you, let's see, I have to find it. I usually use Media Encoder, which comes with Adobe Cloud. But if you want to render it in After Effects, you can click File, Export, Add to Render Queue. So Render Queue will pop up here where your timeline usually is. You can click back and forth as a tab, and it'll give you some settings. And the settings are essentially the same as what Media Encoder looks like. So I'm actually going to look at Media Encoder. So if I go File, Export, Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. And Media Encoder is a separate program. but it's really useful because it will use a separate memory than your video. So if I want to keep working on the video while I render it, it will send a version of it when I export it to the media encoder, so I don't have to sit there and wait. I can keep working as it renders. So here, media encoder popped up. You can see it's a different app. And it will pop up here. Here's some past things I worked on, both in After Effects. And it'll give you a lot of options. And it's easy to be overwhelmed, but it'll pop up with the composition settings that you already have set. So here is the codec information. I'm going to keep it right there. I don't want to think about that. There's another tab right here called preset, and this is what I use the most. If I want to create a 1080p video for Vimeo, I usually use this option, and this will basically set all the settings that I need. You can hover over it to see what those settings are. If you want something changed, you can click on it. It'll take a second to load. But essentially, in here, you get all the settings that you could need for rendering. You get width, height, frame rate, different encoding settings. You can change audio, which I didn't even talk about, but you can add effects. Not sure what this will do, but I'll find out. Captions, multiplexer, and then you could even have it upload when you're done. But if I want to go with these settings, you can even change the output name, which is what I recommend. I'll name this test output to see what happens. I want it MP4. It'll show up right there. And since I changed this, it'll show the preset as custom. You can save presets and recall presets here, but I'll hit OK. Here's a little sample of what it'll look like. And one thing we notice is, where is the lower third? So I'll hit OK. I'll render this, but then we'll go back and investigate what happened to the lower third. So the best way to do this is to hit the play button up there, but I don't want this to encode. So I'll just hit the minus button right here and it'll just remove it from the queue. So I only want this one to encode. So I'll hit play. This will start to encode. It won't take very long because it's a small video, but like I said, I can close that and come back and see what happened. So what happened is After Effects is context sensitive. So I had the Precomp 1, which is just the video, the Precomp that we made, selected, and not the entire new comp 1. So from there, I want to export, add to Adobe Media Render Queue. And let's go find out if this worked. And we can see the lower third pops in here. So I know that I did it correctly this time. And this one looks like it's already done, so I'll render this one. And from here, you can just click on this and it'll pop up the location. And let's just see what it looks like. Oh, open on the wrong screen, so give me a second. You can see it turned out blue because we checked that blue LUT setting. A LUT is a lookup table, basically just a way to change the final colors. So this is the output without that lower third. We have our video content right here. We have the image we dragged in right there, rotated a bit. And now we can see our test output too. You can also see it right here. And this time, I didn't use the LUT, and you can see the lower third pop in with the fun animation that we added. So that is the main workflow that you'll use when animating and rendering a video in After Effects. I want to see if I have any other tips that I wrote down. And please ask questions if you have any. especially if you have access to After Effects. Basically everything that I just talked about is accessible. If I want to close this project, there's a file, Control W. It'll save it. It'll save that. If I want to close the whole thing, you can close project. I don't want to see this. So then you'll get this blank thing. But if I want to go over basically everything that I just talked about here, in this first After Effects that pops up, this splash screen, is a very useful tool. Instead of creating a new video or opening a project, there's a Learn tab right here. And these tutorials will actually open within your After Effects app, which I find a lot more useful than watching a video. So I clicked on that one tutorial. It'll take a second to load. Maybe it didn't open correctly, so I'll try it again.
While it's loading, in which situation would you use Premiere and which situation would you use After Effects? Because I am a Premiere user, so a lot of the interface is kind of similar.
Yeah. So a lot of the interface shortcuts are similar, but what you can't do as easily in Premiere is animate things, add effects. So a lot of people use After Effects and Premiere together. You can actually open like compositions into Premiere. So a workflow that's pretty common is people will create compositions in After Effects and import them into Premiere. And then they can go change all the details of the After Effects composition without having to work in Premiere, which is, I guess you would think of it as the final editing app in your workflow.
Right.
So you can go work on the After Effects animation without having to worry about all that information being in your Premiere Pro project.
Right. And you don't need to render them. You can import them in the native, whatever is the native format for After Effects.
Right. You don't have to worry about all the rendering stuff that I talked about earlier. Yeah, it's a much cleaner workflow. And I am wondering why these tutorials aren't opening. But essentially, it could be because I'm on Zoom or something. But essentially, when those pop up, especially your first time, you can click on any of these tutorials here and it'll open up a sample project in After Effects and let you like mess with the assets and stuff. I don't know why it's not working at the moment. Did you have any other questions? I'm probably about to wrap up this video.
My main questions relate to both Premiere and After Effects. For Premiere is pretty good with titles. Can you show me what you just show me? You don't need to actually go through the motions. What you can do with titles in After Effects?
Yeah. So there's a ton of effects. The main thing is the rendering engine is a bit different and it's more focused on graphics. So you'll find the performance is better. There's a bunch of effects. You can a lot of people make effects. Earlier I mentioned the Cinema 4D effect thing.
Got it.
So you can, if there's a plugin that someone has made that you really want, they're usually for After Effects. And I actually haven't used Premiere a ton. I've used it before. It's just much more limited than what you can do, especially if you're doing keying stuff, which is where you want to remove like a green screen. if you want to adjust colors. Actually, I'll try this one more time and show you basically what they say is, what Adobe says is the main uses here, or some of the beginner uses. You can make transitions that you can reuse in a Premiere project. You can repair video, like fix shaky video and exposure, white balance. A lot of animations. There's 3D in After Effects, though I haven't used it. And
that's cool.
Special effects type of stuff. Yeah.
Great. Yep.
If you already know Premiere, you'll probably get a lot of use out of going back and forth and putting your After Effects compositions into Premiere. I don't work with a lot of like footage, so I don't often use Premiere. I don't.
So you edit everything in After Effects. If you have like a 15-minute video, you would do all the editing in After Effects?
Yeah, I don't know if that's probably the suggested workflow, but maybe I'm lazy, but I don't want to go back and forth between apps. I haven't used Premiere that much, but if you know Premiere, it's probably the better way to work. Yeah.
But basically, it is possible to do that in After Effects.
Yeah, it's possible to create as long of a video as you want in After Effects. I've created hour-long videos in After Effects. Rendering takes a long time, which is why I think it's not suggested, especially if you have a lot going on. But then again, you can break things up into compositions so that everything is pre-rendered to a degree if you don't touch those compositions while working.
Yeah, cool.